Good morning, class. I am your teacher, Carolina, and I will be guiding you on this virtual class on chapter 4, 5, and 6 of the Comparative Government book. So let's get started. Today I'm going to teach 3 chapters that all connect to one central question in AP Comparative Government. Why do governments gain, keep, or lose power? To answer that question, we will first have to understand what is democracy, what is authoritarianism, and finally, how political culture shapes both of these systems. These chapters connect directly to the AP Comparative Government course description because they explain all 5 of the course's big ideas. For example, power and authority. Who holds political power? Legitimacy and stability. Ask why citizens accept governments. Democratization explains how countries become more or less democratic. Internal and external forces explain how culture, identity, and globalization shape politics. Finally, methods of political analysis teaches us how political scientists compare governments using data instead of your own opinion. Let's dive right in. What is democracy? The first chapter begins with democracy. When most people hear the word democracy, they simply think, oh, it's government by the people. Yes, it is. However, the textbook immediately explains that democracy is a little more complicated than that. One quote that stood out to me said this, quote, "The core principle of democracy is self-rule." The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power of rule. But the chapter reminds us that democracy is not an all or nothing. Another important quote says, "There is no absolutes when it comes to understanding democracy." This really stood out to me because instead of classifying countries how we usually would, like this is strictly democratic or authoritarian, rather it kind of shows us how democracy is in a spectrum. And political scientists compare democracies using organizations like the Freedom House and the Democracy Index to see where different countries place on this index. Now I'm going to give an example that really brought this all into perspective, which was Norway is the model democracy. So the textbook uses Norway as the strongest example of modern democracy since it ranked first on the Democracy Index with a score of 9.81 out of 10. And
they live in the world's best democracy, Norway. Last month, this oil-rich kingdom was ranked the world's best democracy for the 6th year running. The same study downgraded the United States to a flawed democracy. So, what makes Norway so great?
You have a vibrant competition between parties, high participation between different parts of the citizenry, so everyone is involved in elections, and the political debate climate is much milder than in the US. More cooperation and less confrontation.
We have a great democracy.
People are engaged in politics everywhere in the society.
I think US politics is too much influenced by money.
And I think US needs to build the election system again.
why did it score this high is because it had very free and fair elections and very low corruption, an independent judiciary, protected civil liberties, a free press, and also a high political participation, I believe. So that chapter also connects democracy with quality of life. So it's basically saying that Norway consistently ranks near the top of the Human Development Index and also the World Happiness Report, suggesting that a strong democratic institution often supports social stability. And I saw this really big connection between in this example of Norway with big idea 2, legitimacy and stability, since when citizens trust their institutions, governments are generally more stable. Okay, this kind of brings us into what I wanted to talk to you guys as well, which is democracy and a spectrum. So, democracy index separates countries into 2 major democratic categories. First are full democracies. These countries have strong institutions, independent courts, political freedoms, and active participation. Only about 24 countries fall into this category. The second category is flawed democracies. These countries still hold elections but experience problems such as corruption, weak institution, political polarization, or declining trust. And I think this really put into perspective in many of the South American countries that I visited and I'm more familiar with, because they are democracies, because they have elections, but they're so there's so much problems because they don't really hold what a true democracy is. And this chapter really put into perspective in comparing the two. So the textbook also notes the United States is considered a flawed democracy because of issues like political polarization and declining trust in institutions, which is really interesting in the way that we believe, well, not everyone, but like, for example, a lot of people believe that the United States is held to this pedestal of freedom, even though it's pretty much not. One more thing I wanted to talk about before moving on to chapter 5 was what is democratization? So political scientists they mentioned in the textbook were Samuel Hutchison described 3 waves of democratization, which the first expanded voting rights during the 19th century, the second happened after World War II, and the third began in 1974, I believe, when countries in like Southern Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe transitioned away from authoritarian governments. However, democracy is not permanent. Countries can also experience democratic backsliding, which is a new term I learned, where democratic institutions slowly become weaker, which brings us to basically chapter 5, which is what is authoritarianism? Democracy distributes power, authoritarianism concentrates it. The textbook defines authoritarianism as a political system in which government is controlled by the ruling elite without an open mandate from citizens. Instead of accountability, authoritarian governments rely on centralized power, limited political participation, media control, and restriction on rights. One of the biggest lessons I learned was that authoritarian governments are much more diverse than I once expected. Not every authoritarian government looks the same. For example, let's talk about Turkey. The chapter begins talking about Turkey. Turkey was once viewed as a country that was moving towards democracy.
We often use the term executive power out of habit, but under the 2017 system, executive power in practice means one person. Power is concentrated at the center around the president. The institutional balance between parliament, government, and the judiciary was replaced by a highly personalized system of rules. Looking back, I think one weakness of the opposition was that we did not fully understand, or at least did not fully communicate to society the depth of this transformation, this change. We sometimes continue to behave as if Turkey was still operating within a competitive democratic framework. But after 2017, the rules of the game had changed in much more radical way.
Following the failed coup attempt in 2016, thousands of political opponents were arrested. Turkey's democracy index score fell right after that, from 5.12, I believe, in 2014 to 4.35 in 2022. That's a lot. And this demonstrates democratic backsliding, which is what I kind of mentioned before. Instead of democracy disappearing over the night, it slowly weakens over time. So over almost 10 years, it went down 1 point something percent. It wasn't a total drop. It was gradual and going back and back, Okay, so how do these authoritarian rulers keep their power? According to the textbook, authoritarian governments generally maintain their power using 4 major tools. The first is coercion, which means using threats or force to make people obey. The second is patronage, where leaders reward loyal supporters with jobs, contracts, and resources. The third is military, which protects the regime as much as the country itself. And finally, government often control the media to shape public opinion and reduce criticism. So these tools all reinforce big idea 1, power and authority, because they explain how rulers stay in power. Okay, so by the end of these 2 chapters, we began to realize the government really fit nearly or neatly into one category. Instead, countries move along a spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism. So why do citizens in different countries think so differently about government in the first place? So I think that's a good transition for us to move into chapter 6, political culture, where we'll basically explore how values, beliefs, identity, trust, and culture basically influence politics around the world. Okay, first of all, what is political culture? Now that we've compared democracy and authoritarianism, why do people in different countries think so differently about government? Chapter 6 answers this question through the concept of political culture. The textbook defines political culture as, quote, the sum of individual and group values, belief, attitude, norms, and expectation regarding politics and government. In other words, political culture is how people think about politics. It shapes whether citizens trust governments, whether they participate in politics, what they expect from leaders, and even how they react to political crises. This directly connects to the big idea for internal and external forces, because political culture is one of the strongest internal forces influencing political systems today. Okay, I saw this really good connection between chapter 5 and 6, which is political culture in authoritarian regimes. So basically, the chapter examines how political culture and authoritarian systems work. So authoritarian leaders often argue that stability, security, and national unity are more important than political freedom. The chapter uses Syria as an example. For example, Bashar al-Assad portrays himself as protecting the state, while opposing it's treated as a threat to national security. The chapter also discusses Russia, where surveys found many citizens expressing nostalgia for the Soviet Union and supporting strong leadership over political competition. And this demonstrates that political culture exists in authoritarian regimes as well, although it often emphasizes authority rather than participation. Okay, let's wrap everything up and connect everything. So chapter 4 taught us what democracy looks like. Chapter 5 explained how authoritarian governments gain and maintain power. And chapter 6 explains why citizens think differently about these systems. Together, these chapters show that governments are shaped by much more than constitutions or elections. They are shaped by history, culture, identity, trust, leadership, and institutions. So that's what I leave you all today.